I'd never heard of the SANE program until several years after I had been raped. A scientist from our lab came up to me and asked me would I be interested in speaking to a class of SANE nurses. And I said, well, what is that? And she explained to me that's a sexual assault nurse examiner who works one-on-one with a rape victim. And I said, absolutely. I said, and how do you get this program started?
A SANE nurse is a sexual assault nurse examiner, and that's a nurse who's specially trained in conducting a sexual assault exam. The training includes not only where to look for evidence, how to collect evidence, but how to interview a victim properly so that you are able to collect the evidence you need. The SANE nurse works as a part of the Sexual Assault Response Team, or the SART team. Basic members of the SART team are the SANE nurse, the advocate, the law enforcement officer, the prosecutor, and the crime lab specialist. So the next thing I'm going to do is have you get undressed so I can collect the rest of the evidence. So here's a roll. Most advocates know that victims can come in and have an exam for up to 72 hours, but they don't realize that the longer they wait, the less evidence that we can collect. The evidence that we're able to collect is lost dramatically within the first 5 to 12 hours after an assault. So it's real important for advocates to know that even though, yes, we can do an exam, and we'll do an exam up to 72 hours, the sooner the victim gets in, the more likelihood we will have of getting positive results. What we're going to do today is we're going to primarily focus on your role as a part of the sexual assault response team. We're going to talk about...
You really have to be clear on what the protocols are in terms of what the advocate does, what the SANE nurse does, what the police do, so that you can better serve the victim.
In the emergency room, we now have a responsibility to let victims know that even though we don't know who the assailant is now, if we are able to collect his body fluids and they're able to identify his DNA, that'll be able to put in the data bank, and it might be years later that they'll identify who it was.
We have nurses from SARS come into our training program and give a 2 or 3 hour training so that people have an idea of where to stand when the exam's going on, what's going to happen, those sorts of things.
What is done with the DNA evidence if it doesn't match? Does it stay within the indexing system?
If we as advocates want to be able to let the victim survivors know what's going to happen if they choose option A over option B, we better know what's going to happen. And so having that open dialogue between the police, the victim advocates, the SANE nurses, et cetera, really facilitates our being able to understand the process. And that's really our job as advocates, is understanding it so we can communicate it to victim survivors.
You want some more? The lives that they touch reaches much further than just that victim that they see. Because if they can help that victim on her road to recovery, then you have a victim who goes home and takes that to everybody around her.
Mama.
What, honey?
Choo-choo.
You.
February 18th, 1994, I had just come home from work, and I opened the front door, and the rapist immediately began hitting me in the head with a hard object. My physical condition after the rape was pretty bad. I mean, he beat me severely. I knew that I needed medical attention for those wounds, but also I knew that I needed medical attention because I had been raped. I knew that they needed to collect evidence so that I could get the bad guy. The first responder, he asked me to tell him what happened. And so I described to him very briefly what had happened, not going into a lot of detail. I remember there were parts of my rape that I didn't have vocabulary for. You know, I didn't know that people did things like that. So how are you supposed to describe it to somebody if you have never experienced before, or even imagine it before? How can you find the words to describe it? And so the credibility of the victim comes into play because they didn't tell all of that right then. But it should be expected. It's going to take time for that crisis moment to kind of settle, for them to find it in themselves to be able to say it.
Not collecting certain things, such as anal swabs, oral swabs, could prove detrimental to a case if those areas were penetrated and there might be viable DNA evidence present there, because those will be lost because you only have one shot to collect the evidence that you need.
What we will typically do is our law enforcement officer, our street cops will take a real brief initial history from the victim. Then we'll talk with them in more detail and we'll give that information to the law enforcement officer. Okay, I'm going to start by asking you a few questions about what happened. The victims are often much more willing to tell us things they might have been hesitant to tell the cops. So if you could start by telling me what happened when you first met the man.
I was able to go into a lot of detail with her because I had told the story 3 or 4 times now. It was getting a bit easier. My boyfriend was with me. I felt like I had somebody there to watch over me. And so I was able to tell her pretty much all of the different ways that he had penetrated me so that they would be able to find all of the evidence that they needed. I expected everything to go over to the crime lab or wherever your evidence goes, and it was all going to be processed and going to be solved within a week.
Okay, the first room we're going to go into is actually, it's referred to as an evidence examination room.
I think education is very important to the role that we play here as crime laboratory analysts. These processes don't occur like they do on TV, that they don't occur within, a 40-minute window with commercials, and that some of these processes take anywhere from a couple of hours to work to a 2-day process. And there are as many as 10 or so processes in any given DNA case that evidence must go through.
And when I spray it, any areas that have semen on the panties, like I said, were transferred over here. And actually, as it's coming up like this, I typically would take my pencil and circle the areas that come up first.
I think proper education through victim advocates will assist victims in understanding the processes that we go through with the evidence that's been collected by the nurse at the time of the rape exam.
Knowledge is power. And if you empower your victims with the knowledge that you have, they can better understand what's going on and not be so frustrated when the system's not working the way that they want it to. They'll understand why.
In the database, both at the state level and at the national level, are known convicted offender samples, which are part of the CODIS system, the Combined DNA Index system, as well as unknown profiles that are developed from cases worked by state and local laboratories around the United States. So a local laboratory, through their state DNA index system, is capable of then searching the entire country for not only against known offender profiles, but also unknown offender profiles that have been developed in casework. So not only can we link cases to each other, but we can link cases to suspects. If there is no known suspect in the case, that search may take anywhere from weeks to months to years in order to find the individual who is responsible.